We're very, very excited, absolutely flabbergasted that Patrick BYRNE is here with us today. I think he really became famous because he was the CEO of Overstock.com, which very early on started accepting Bitcoin as payment for their service and for their products. He since has really gone forward and become an entrepreneur in the Bitcoin and blockchain space. He really takes a very, very global and historical perspective about what's happening to the world right now vis-a-vis the cryptocurrencies and the whole decentralization of blockchain and what it enables worldwide. Patrick BYRNE, everybody. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bart, very much. What a conference and what an honor it is. I understand this to be the first time sort of Wall Street has welcomed blockchain in to say, clearly there's going to be a meeting of minds. And it is an especial honor for me because I know that I'm a somewhat controversial figure around town, especially for some of the folks who were here. I'm going to try to stay away from those whole subjects, although we'll glance off it once or twice. Who am I? That is the Bitcoin Messiah and the scourge of Wall Street. And I'm sorry I've been described that way. I don't feel like the scourge. I want you to know I come from Wall Street. I come from a Wall Street family. I grew up under the tutelage of Buffett. Both my brothers were at Solomon in the 80s. I worked for a guy named Sandy Gottesman and Arthur Zankel at First Manhattan in the early 90s. So I sort of came out of this world and maybe felt overly familiar with it. I'd like to, so I feel that this is an introduction for a lot of you people, for a lot of Wall Street. You see this whole revolution coming and you're wondering what it's about. And I want to give you a good general introduction to what we of the blockchain community are really about and how we view the world. And there is a place, there is a fusion possible. There is a place for us to work together. But if you want to understand where we're coming from, there's a particular book you want to read, which is called Snow Crash, and it introduces a certain way of looking at history, which is that these are just a bunch of different operating systems competing in a petri dish. You don't feel any more allegiance to one than the other, Macintosh versus PC, it's all the same. These are just operating systems that what we're talking about, and they're playing out over the course of history. Now I have, as great as an honor it is to speak with you, I get an even bigger honor in who I get to talk to. I frequently get to talk to your sons and daughters at universities, and it is really such an incredible honor. I get invited all the time to speak to them. And I tell them this history they don't know, and it's surprising that the school system doesn't teach this anymore. But it's the history of one of these operating systems. And it's the one that we of the blockchain world, I knew I was in the right, I'd written the right speech when I saw Jeffrey Tucker here. I knew that it's the first time so this is the operating system to which the people in the blockchain world are committed. And it's the operating system called liberalism. That's a word that's misused today, but philosophical liberalism means a certain political tradition. When I talk to your sons and daughters, I tell them I did a PhD in philosophy, so you don't have to. And then I compress years and years into about 45 minutes. I'm going to compress it to about 3 for you. And to understand where this is, why blockchain is part of this really grand historical tradition, starting, and I walk them through the key elements of all these different traditions, the Hebrews, Greeks, Romans, English, Spanish, the Dutch, and then these ideas came out of the Dutch through some English Protestants who fled England and they went and lived in Holland and these are ideas like consent of the governed and tolerance and political pluralism and limited government, constitutional government, separation of powers, all these kinds of things came out of this tradition, came on, some English Protestants went and lived in Holland, got fed up with it, they came and lived here and they brought the ideas from Holland along with a philosopher named John Locke, who left the English glorious revolution and sat for 3 years in Amsterdam and learned these ideas. And you can actually, and then Jefferson read him and read all this tradition and gave it to the other founding fathers, read the Spanish scholastics and such. And these all showed up in our Declaration and our Constitution. And this very idea of the individual as principal and government as agent, and not the other way around, which is how people sort of, well, how history tends to play it. And you can walk through, so this is basically a course, and in a perfect world I've given this course actually, but where you can trace all these wonderful ideas into our Constitution and where they came from. Now, part of this tradition, the classical liberal tradition, is that this went amok, and it went amok in a variety of different ways. It got captured, which is as our founding fathers expected, in Federalist Number 10, that they understood that they said we had looked at all the previous, Madison wrote it, we've looked at the previous models of democracy, ancient and modern, and we designed our Constitution to address all the things that made them fail, but there's one thing we didn't solve for, and it's the thing that makes democracies fail more than anything else, and that's special interests. And they actually predicted that. And then some philosophical, some bad cases, but what really happened in our tradition, what really happened to the world, is we got gangstered. We got gangstered in a very particular way that we're still sore about. And I can tell you your sons and daughters never know this history. I don't know if people in this room will. But we got, and when I say gangster, I mean this way. When in the 80s, there was a Marxist revolutionary running Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega. I happened to be in Nicaragua some months ago, and he's back in power. He's president, and he's president for life. Now, they had a constitutional amendment that said he could not be president for more than 2 terms, but he stuffed the Supreme Court, and they decided that term in the Constitution was unconstitutional, and they got rid of it, and so now he's president forever. And that's what I mean by gangsterism, when somebody has to sort of gangster. So in our case, well, it actually happened with a hardcore Italian socialist about a century ago, hardcore left, a syndicalist. The only syndicalist I know today is Noam Chomsky. But you know, Marxism broke into there were 2 families. There were the Leninists who thought that you would have central planning, but there was this other group, Sorel, Gramsci eventually, and this Italian who believed in syndicalism, corporate syndicalism, which is that the role of the central government is this great powerful thing that organizes the conversations among the corporations and the syndicates and the unions and such, and manages that, and that's how they run the economy. This syndicalist, with this very hardcore, he was actually considered too hard, he ran the socialist newspaper in Italy, considered too hardcore left by most of his colleagues. He did fight in World War I and came out, slightly amended his theories, didn't change at all how you would organize society, but added this stuff about only we have been bloodied in war, should talk about the future. Anyone know who this hardcore lefty I'm talking about? It was Benito Mussolini. He was actually a hardcore socialist, and he was very much admired in the United States. In fact, he was the proverbial dictator who made trains run on time. And in fact, the Columbia University Economics Department got very into this, very successful. Remember, there was a Cole Porter song, "You're the top, you're the great Houdini, you're the top, you're my Mussolini." He was a very admired figure. I was a terrible singer. I bet Jeffrey Tucker could sing that. He did this interesting, the Columbia University Economics Department got very into this guy. And as Breitbart is to Donald Trump, these folks were to Franklin Roosevelt. And the people around Roosevelt adopted, and there were explicit fascists among them. There were people who described themselves, by the way, fascism is a term, there were people, now it's a pejorative, it was not necessarily there. The Roosevelt's New Deal was consciously modeled on Mussolini's way of how you structure a country. Mussolini was quite popular in the US until 1935 when he invaded Ethiopia. So Roosevelt's New Deal was structured on that. The Supreme Court correctly said this was all unconstitutional and kept throwing it out. In the spring of 1936, Roosevelt said, I'm going to pack the Supreme Court with 6 new people, take it to 15 unless you roll. And the Supreme Court in the spring of 37 came out and started rubber stamping all kinds of unconstitutional stuff. It was called the switch in time that saved 9. And the result was a bunch of decisions like Wickard versus Filburn, which punched holes in the Constitution and gave us a much different country than had been envisioned in that liberal tradition. And we, the classical liberals, are have envisioned a day where we could return to that. The outcome of that for our society is that what had been designed to be sort of a beehive of self-organizing systems, common law and markets, we became a society where the guy in the corner office with the pointy hair makes decisions for you. When it's really a common denominator of all the Dilbert comic strips, it's the guy in the corner who thinks he knows more than you making decisions for you. And that became the society we evolved into. Blockchain is the solution to this for the following reason. For 6,000 years, we have relied on central institutions to govern, to mediate our exchanges. Blockchain lets us have consensual exchange without relying on these central institutions about which so many of us have become skeptical. So, as you come to know the blockchain world, this is sort of the governing philosophy, that blockchain is a solution that can let us win this fight we've been in for 500 years, this fight for political liberalism. Where can we apply it? There's this project I'm super excited about. There's 7.5 billion people in the world. 5 billion of them do not live in the world as you and I know it. They live, I won't walk through all the slides, but it's basically, they live in a world where you're in a favela, and you may have been there 4 generations, and you don't know, you don't have any incentive to improve where you live, because the local generalissimo can show up any day and say, no, senor, this was your land, this was my grandfather's land, this was not your land, and you don't have any piece of paper you can borrow money against and start a business and be an entrepreneur. There's the economist who noticed this is a guy named Hernando de Soto. He's from Peru. It's kind of shocking. He's not yet won the Nobel Prize. He noticed this in the 90s, and in the 80s, there was a terrorist movement going on in Peru called the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path. And he had this idea, and the idea basically runs like this. In California, the Sierra Nevada, there were 850 different mining camps, and every one of these mining camps had their own rules, and there's some guy with a rule book and with a ledger, and okay, when you want to lay a stake to that stretch of stream, you mark it in here, and this is the book we all agree is the truth. And that's how it worked in 1849, and over the next decade, as lawyers and judges showed up, they stitched the whole thing together into the state law of California. Well, Hernando, to some extent, did that in Peru in about 91, 92. The Shining Path were unstoppable. They had conquered 60% of the company. Our Secretary of State said it was the most dangerous problem in the Western Hemisphere. And they implemented Hernando's ideas, and in 6 months, the revolution collapsed. The leaders actually had to turn themselves in to be protected from the people. It had been like a Khmer Rouge style thing. Well, the theory is that we can, now I'll walk through these slides quickly. This is just, this is about how these ledgers exist everywhere. The ledgers I described in California, they exist everywhere. Even ISIS, when they roll into a town, this is what they would sell. They're basically saying, let me see your certificate of occupancy. Do you support ISIS? Do you support the Muslim Brotherhood? And if you do, we put our stamp on it. If you don't, you're on your own. These people, I'm just going to flip through this. If somebody tries in the developing world to get title, here's the real problem. If you try to get title, if you're in Haiti, it may take you 30 years, 250 steps, 250 bribes you have to pay along the way. It's essentially impossible. And so all kinds of bad things result from this. It's the succor of terrorist movements. It's what they sell. It's what they're selling on the ground is recognition of your informal property rights. So even in these informal places where there's not land title in any legal or political sense, there are organizations who are maintaining records of who they think owns what, and the terrorist movements are going in and basically saying, we'll recognize that in return and give you legal protection in return for your support, and not the governments. We think this can all be changed. This can all be changed through the magic of blockchain and digital marketing, social media, and mobile apps. Well, Overstock happens to be really good at all those things. And this is why we started taking Bitcoin 4 years ago, more than 4 years ago now, that it was to develop this blockchain expertise. So we are building a system that we're in partnership with Hernando, this was all announced a couple months ago, to take his ideas and make what happened in California in the 1850s, the turning of all these informal compacts into state law, and what he did in Peru in the 1991-92 and completely changed. It's the last time the West won a terrorist movement, by the way. It's when they did this in Peru, and they won in 6 months. We now think we can take that idea and through these technologies go global very quickly, very quickly. Yeah, so Hernando and I are in a partnership. So Overstock has a blockchain arm called Medici, and Medici has made 12 investments, and this is one of them. It's taking Hernando's ideas and making them go global. The possibilities that come with that, once you have global capital, the calculation is there are tens of trillions, or he thinks even more, over hundreds of trillions of dollars in capital that can be free, that can come into existence. And the magic thing is, it will come into existence in a very decentralized way, not in the hands of any government or NGO or corporation, but into the hands of everybody who's taking part of this and who can have. And by the way, even in poor countries, while 15% of people at most have a bank account, 140% of people may have a cell phone, because people have two. So the more that we can move into mobile apps on the cell phone, the more you can accomplish what economists have been trying to do for decades, which is solve the problem of the unbanked. As long as you have 2/3 of the world that's outside the formal sector without legal rights, no tie into the formal financial system, there's not ever going to be progress for them. Well, you can solve that problem. We have a whole effort going on in this. It's been public for about 2 months, and the goal is, we will be launching trial countries this year, and the goal is over 5 years. We think we can change the world for 5 billion people, or that's the hope anyway. Warning, because I'm now under SEC investigation, as I've been 7 times in my life. I don't know if this is actually going to cure poverty. It's far too risky for anyone to invest in. Do not invest in this. It's way too risky. It's going to tick off a lot of oligarchies in developing countries, because what's really gone on is, they're rent-seeking. There's rent-seeking. In fact, his opposition, it's funny, he's been doing this for 27 years, Hernando de Soto. He says the opposition comes from the political class when they understand that what this is empowering the merchant. This is depriving the political class of power and turning power over to the bazaar and turning power over to the people. So it's a really revolutionary idea, and it's going to be hard for, there's countries that want us in with it and countries that don't know. But at the end of the day, there's an awful lot of this that we think we can get done. We're going to be able to get done just through, without really knowing the opinion and what the government, or caring too much what the opinions of the governor. We're giving it a way for the informal people of the world to register their property claims. I think it's going to be an enormously revolutionary act. So, SEC warnings aside, this is hugely, so anytime I talk now, there are people who say, well, BYRNE didn't say that this may be, there's people who write blogs, BYRNE didn't say that this is risky. It's silly to me. Everything we're doing is enormously risky and may not work. Let me talk to a different institution, more closer to the heart here, and that's settlement. Now, settlement, I'm sure most people here know, so we don't have to really. Settlement is when an investor on one side is buying some stock on the other, each are represented by broker-dealers, the act of trading, of exchanging the stock and money is the settlement. When I was a kid, I came to New York and I saw Wall Street, but all I remember was the bicycles. And there were guys on bicycles in Wall Street, and I wondered what that was about. And my father explained, and then there were guys with sacks, but they had literally sacks and these big cases of stock certificates. And what they were doing was running among the different stockbrokers, settling, carrying 3 days after the trade, carrying the certificates. It was complicated systems of how you clip the corners, if the certificate was for 100 and you were delivering this, or all this stuff. In the 1960s, volume on Wall Street quadrupled. And the guys on bicycles log jammed. It led to what's called the Great Wall Street Paperwork Crisis. And for 3 years, from 68 to 71, Wall Street was only open 4 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and limited trading hours each day. It was so the guys with the burlap sacks could catch up with the trading. The SEC called the industry together, said, how are we going to fix this? There were two proposals in 1971 considered. One proposal was a peer-to-peer electronic settlement system among the brokers. That was their preferred alternative. They organized into a group called the NASD. That was the origin of the NASD, was when they organized to push for that settlement solution. The other group, the other solution was a solution called immobilization. And we're going to pick a vault. I know it had been tried in Vienna in the 1860s. I don't know if it but the idea was the stock would be immobilized, and then entitlements to that stock would then trade in the system. The SEC forced down the throats of the industry the solution number 2, which didn't want it. And that solution was we create the DTCC, which was actually a company within the New York Stock Exchange at the time. And that has this vault, and we put all the stock, the legal ownership of the stock. Now, don't be confused. I sometimes ask people, raise your hand if you own any publicly traded stock in America. And you probably know this trick by now because I've done too many. Nobody owns any stock. All the stock in America is owned by a corporation almost no one's heard of. It's all owned by CETI. And then it is issued it's issued contractual claims against that stock that propagates out into the DTC and trades among accounts at the DTCC. And of course, there's clearing brokers who are connected directly, and there are referring brokers. So what's going on in the stock market as all the trading goes on is this. The stock, now I don't mean any criticism of the folks in the DTCC, and the fellow who runs it now, I'm blocking on his name for the second. He's a very classy guy. Asked me to see him a number of times. And this is what I got in a fight about some years ago, a dozen years ago. I don't want to dwell on it, but I'll mention, because I know everybody knows, I'm just going to mention for a second. It's old history, what the hell. But no, I'm going to tell this quick story. Somebody started writing really nonsense accusations about me and these things. I wasn't paying any attention. Then they went after this 79-year-old man on my board. And a guy had been the press CEO of NASDAQ, actually, coincidentally. And he, I said something publicly in some earnings call. I don't know who these jerks are who are attacking Gordon Macklin. They're idiots, blah, blah, blah. And next thing I know, I got a phone call from a hedge fund manager. And the hedge fund manager says, hey, leave those people alone. Don't be upset about this. This is just this research shop. How it works is we pay them $25,000 a year. And for that, you get to order 2 hatchet jobs. So we get to write up a hatchet job and give it to them, and then they publish it. So somebody's done that to you. Somebody's hired them just to do this. Don't take that personally, Patrick. I said, gee, that didn't sound right to me. I thought the guy was kidding. That was like, well, it was. So anyway, that led me into this exploration. Eventually, because some of the people led to some of the people, and me being Irish, the old joke, what's Irish Alzheimer's? It's when you forget everything but your grudges. I forgot my grudges. But anyway, it led me into, gave me a reason ultimately to learn about the settlement system. And this didn't seem right to me. In particular, not only does it seem vulnerable to manipulation, but it seems enormously vulnerable. It seemed enormously vulnerable to settlement risk, to systemic risk. And that is, in fact, this has been written out of history. But when October 23rd, 08, he was called out of retirement, Greenspan, to testify before Congress, people have forgotten what he said.
There are additional regulatory changes that this breakdown of the central pillar of competitive markets requires in order to return to stability, particularly in the areas of fraud, settlement, and securitization.
We all know the fraud, Bernie Madoff, et cetera, securitization, mortgage-backed securities. But the crisis itself was a settlement crisis. September 15, 2008, what happened was the settlement system froze. That crazy meshigas, all that swirling stock, or stock entitlements, that froze up, and no one knew who they could trade with anymore, exactly as I'd been screaming about for 3 years, which is when sort of the cone of silence descended. So anyway, I've been interested in this area for a very long time, and it seems to me sort of an issue of national security. It seems to me the essence of a capital market. And the most important thing about the capital, to me, capital markets are sacred. I grew up, Milton Friedman was my great friend, and Ken Arrow, and I pray in the church of capital markets. So to me, understanding that system where the shares are actually owned by one entity and all we're trading are daisy chains of contractual rights seems like a lot could go wrong with it. And it's not because the people in it are bad. It got designed that way. It got designed that way in 1971 in a hurry. And as Milton Friedman says, nothing is so, and it was adopted as a temporary government solution. And Milton Friedman said nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program. And in 1978, it was made permanent. And in fact, in 1986, the SEC hired a guy named Pollock. It's been kind of forgotten in history. A fellow named Pollock wrote the Pollock Report. I think he may have been a retired judge or a commissioner. And he wrote a report describing the great vulnerabilities of this system. And it was just like a historical fluke. We took that track because we could not do at the time a direct peer-to-peer electronic settlement system as the industry wanted it. We couldn't do it. Now comes along the blockchain. What a ledger lets us do is imagine a magic ledger that's cryptographically protected. Of course, there can be copies of it and so forth. It's immutable. It's as public and transparent as we design it to be. And settlement becomes a matter of just changing entries in a ledger, right? Scrubbing out one guy's coin and adding a coin. That's what settlement can now be. And with stock, it can be turned into a ledger. So this system of net settlement, see, what bothers me about this, and again, I mean no offense to anybody who's involved with this, and there have to be people in the room. I hate to be criticizing but to me, this underlying system, it didn't come out of a burning bush. It's something we did in the 1970s. And the mistake is the original sin is net settlement in my mind. Once you have net settlement, when you have gross settlement, you buy this baseball glove from me, or you buy 10 shares of IBM from me, I'm giving you my 10 shares, just like it's my baseball glove. Net settlement is how it works today, where you have, you folks know where, it means that when the SEC sees something they think is illegal, and they want to find it, they do something called blue sheeting it. They want to say who's behind such and such a trade. The trades themselves disappear off into this mist of netting and pre-netting and all this stuff, and they can't even track some stuff. That can all be simplified, and what horrifies me is the idea that the actual legal ownership is with a company, and all the public's really trading are contractual rights around. So I think that's going to melt away. And I think somebody said recently, maybe someone can tell me here who it was. By the way, I don't have a clock up here. So could you, so I've got 15 minutes left. Okay. I saw recently somebody said that somebody on Wall Street said that 100% of the instruments of the stocks and bonds being issued today could be issued on tokens. And in 5 years, 100% of these stocks and bonds will be issued on tokens. That is suggesting that that plumbing, that architecture of Wall Street could melt away in 5 years. I mean, that's what that claim is. I don't know about the pace, but I think the advantages of this kind of an approach are so overwhelming. We've been working on this for several years, which makes us, I think, old timers in this industry. We've been working on this. In early 2005, we bought SpeedRoute, which routes 2.5% of the order flow of the United States capital markets. So we bought something that was already SEC compliant, FINRA, everything. We didn't want to do a Mt. Gox, and I knew I didn't want to get in trouble. So we wanted to buy something right in the middle of the regulatory system and blockchainize it. The securities lending industry is a very profitable industry. Welcome to their profits to the extent that it's all legit. At some point, the question is the lack of transparency coming out of the hide of the pension funds whose money the pension funds who are their clients. We think some transparency in that system will help it. That's going to help some people and hurt some people. I know that's a touchy issue in this industry, but it's going to help some people in the industry and hurt some people to get transparency in there. So we have developed a system. Now, this is a cartoon, not true to life, in case there's any lawyers in the room. The T0 is software that is licensed and sits on a broker's desk and runs an overnight auction for digital locates, and of which part of it stays for the license for the software and part of it is remitted, it goes back to the beneficial owner. So we think that's a pretty disruptive product. Don't know what its adoption will be. I mean, it's being used by one broker, but it's a product that I think is ripe for bringing to the securities lending industry. Here's a SpeedRoute. SpeedRoute is the technology within T0, this smart routing system that's already routed into all the exchanges. And I think there's not another business like it in America. It's a broker that doesn't have any clients other than other brokers. And it just does smart routing for medium and size, well, actually some big brokers too. We are connecting it up with the different crypto exchanges. Of course, and we are also, has been announced, we're working on a platform that will be SEC compliant. So this last year's big explosion in ICOs, it was a little concerning to some people. Some people loved it. The ICOs, in my view, to be honest, the utility tokens, there's been a long-standing principle, 80, 70 years in this country. We can't have people just raising money from the public without it having some government holy water sprinkled on it in some sense. So you can't be selling securities to the public to raise capital without some degree of regulation. A lot of those utility tokens look to me like they were designed around those regulations. So, well, it's not a security, it's a utility token because, blah, blah, blah. Well, it looks to me like those days are over. We can argue the how many angels can dance on the head of the pin philosophy of it all, but at the end of the day, those days seem to be over. A few weeks ago, Chairman Clayton of the SEC said, I've never seen an ICO that isn't a security. So I don't know what they're going to do about the past, but I think the issuance of what's been called the ICO is something that has come and gone, and anyone who wants to be part of that world is going to be moving into security tokens. And so I distinguish between ICOs and security tokens. I know this is inside baseball, but to me the ICO world is the world of utility tokens. And I think the SEC has shown I've been surprised how long it took them to react, and they reacted on July 25th with that Dow token decision where they said this Dow token is a utility. I mean, this utility token is secure, it should have been issued like a security, and you skipped all those steps. Since then, but it's been clear, it wasn't clear if they were going to grandfather the past, not grandfather it. It's clear to me now that they're really going to be cracking down on this. And I think they have, legitimately, I'm kind of surprised it took them so long. They've reached out and said, we want to know everything going on to this industry. That's the machinery we are stitching together to make this happen. I remind you, this all may fail. This is all wildly, risky. I swear I can't give a speech without some guy writing a blog about, well, this guy is saying, he's forgetting that there's risks to this, that people may fight back. Okay, so this is all really risky. But anyway, that's why we fight, because ultimately this blockchain is very immersed in a movement. At the edge of the extreme edge of the movement is called the cypherpunk movement. And that book I showed you is the Bible of the cypherpunk movement. But even setting that aside, you should understand there's a real political revolution buried in this move towards blockchain. It's going to advantage people who are adding value, as I know many people do here on Wall Street. But for all kinds of people across society who have some kind of grift going on, I mean, and it's going to, the fact that it becomes transparent and immutable and stuff, as things move to blockchain, it's going to really obviously rock the foundations of our society. I think it's a bigger innovation than the internet itself because of these political and institutional effects it's going to have. So with that, I've got time for 2 or 3 quick questions. Sir.
There are more trades on the stock exchange than there are Visa transactions. Everyone says blockchain can't handle Visa transactions.
Yes, Visa has up to 50,000 transactions a second. Bitcoin's blockchain can only handle about 6 per second. Last I heard, maybe it's up to 10 now. There are lots of ways that can be solved. One is that you can have side chains that do the work and then they stamp or hash the truth periodically to the Bitcoin blockchain. But there's other blockchains like Florin chain, that is a Florin coin that is much, much lower cost. And there are private ledgers emerging like EOS that can handle maybe as many as 1 million transactions a second. So it may be that some common infrastructure emerges of a common blockchain like EOS that everybody is ultimately tapping into the other systems. Good question. Sir, next. T0 is currently US-centric, but it is our ambition. We think we have great routing and exchange technology. I frequently get told, I was just told again by some people I really trust, the guys at T0 are the best guys on routers and exchanges in America. We've taken that team and built the blockchain stuff around it. We do intend to take it to foreign countries. And the fact that we have an SEC-compliant ATS that seems to carry some weight. But we may also do some non-regulated stuff out of this country, stuff that isn't regulated security tokens, but maybe the world of cryptocurrency, but we would keep it out of the core business and off the exchange. Anything that's SEC regulated, we don't want to have, so to speak, that junk come into. We don't know what the SEC's their attitude is going to be to keep that junk off a regulated exchange. So we intend to expand this in numerous different directions, including internationally. Madam, yes, ma'am.
How would you change the U.S. Constitution to enable liberalism and blockchain revolution?
Change the Constitution to, I would say, well, there's only one person to me on the Supreme Court who understands the Constitution. And it showed up in a case called Gonzalez v. Reich. That was this case where California passed a rule that said you can grow pot for medical reasons. A woman having leukemia grew some pot, smoked it, got all the way to the Supreme Court, Gonzalez v. Reich, 2005, and one justice dissented. Of course, all the Republicans and Democrats say, of course, the federal government has that power. It's the federal government. How could they not have the power? To them, that's a tautology. It's the federal government, it has the power. The one justice said, wait a second, if the federal government has the power to do this, they have the power to regulate spelling bees and church socials and anything else. That justice was, of course, Clarence Thomas. That he's the only guy who understands the structure of the Constitution and polycentricity. So I don't know how it happens without an intellectual revolution in the country, but I think that, how do you change the Constitution? I don't think the Constitution needs a change. I think the DC needs the change. I don't think the Constitution needs it.